Ever wondered what it would be like to live in the shadow of one of the most powerful empires in history, but without the riches and grandeur? Picture this. You're walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome, surrounded by stunning palaces, lavish markets, and the glittering elite. But instead of basking in luxury, you're struggling for every scrap of food, fighting for space in overcrowded tenements, and facing daily uncertainty. Welcome to the harsh reality of life as the poor in the Roman Empire. A world where survival was a constant battle, and the divide between the rich and poor couldn't have been more apparent. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the forgotten majority of ancient Rome, the poor, and their daily struggles. From their homes in the insulae to the public baths and the crowded streets, their lives were defined by hardship. Let's dive into what it really meant to live without power, wealth, or status in the heart of one of history's most extraordinary civilizations. The reality of living in Rome. Ancient Rome was one of the greatest empires in the world, immense in scale, culture, and military prowess. Today, we admire the stunning architecture, the rich culture, and the vast empire that spanned continents. But what we often overlook is the stark reality that not everyone lived in luxury. For the poor, the grandeur of Rome was but a distant dream. The population of Rome swelled to nearly 1 million by the 1st century BC. With so many people flocking to the city from all over the empire, the demand for housing and resources grew exponentially. Yet, the city couldn't keep up. Space was at a premium, and for the lower classes, the quality of life was far from glamorous. Imagine living in a tiny, windowless room in a crowded, rickety apartment building. You share it with strangers, surrounded by the noise of 1 million people struggling to survive. There's barely enough room to move, let alone find any peace. As a poor Roman, this wasn't just a bad day, this was your life. The insula, a home or a death trap. If you were poor in ancient Rome, the chances are you lived in an insula. These were multi-story apartment buildings that lined the streets, designed to house the influx of people coming to the city. The insula were the urban equivalent of modern-day slums, overcrowded, poorly built, and often unsafe. Some of these buildings were made from cheap materials like wood, which made them highly susceptible to fire. Fires in these buildings were frequent, and many poor Romans lived in constant fear of their homes being consumed by flames. But it wasn't just the danger of fire. The insulae were death traps in many ways. They were narrow, cramped, and poorly maintained, with little regard for the safety or comfort of the people living in them. Imagine being crammed into a tiny apartment, surrounded by dozens of people, all of you battling for the same basic resources: space, food, and air. The buildings were typically divided into several floors. The lower floors were often occupied by businesses such as taverns, shops, or workshops. The upper floors were where the poor lived. Further up meant cheaper rent, but also meant living at the mercy of the building's poor construction. If you were unlucky enough to live on the top floor, you faced the terrifying prospect of being trapped in a building that could collapse at any moment. The stairs were narrow and rickety, and the rooms were poorly ventilated. Life in the insula was an endless struggle, both physically and mentally, as the constant threat of fire, collapse, or disease loomed over you. A lack of privacy and hygiene. As a poor Roman, privacy was a luxury you simply could not afford. The insulae were essentially giant dormitories with shared rooms and little to no personal space. You were surrounded by strangers, people from all walks of life, each trying to survive in the same cramped quarters. But the lack of privacy wasn't the worst part. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, was a constant challenge. For the rich, keeping clean was easy. They had private bathhouses and running water in their homes, but for the poor, cleanliness was a luxury that came at a price. And often, that price was too high. The public baths were the only option for many poor Romans, but they were far from pleasant. These were communal spaces where men and women bathed together, socialized, and sometimes even did business. The baths were overcrowded, noisy, and filthy. As a poor citizen, you didn't have servants to help you scrub your skin. Instead, you had to fight for space in the water, waiting in line for hours, only to be disappointed when you finally got in. Imagine trying to bathe in a public bath, surrounded by hundreds of strangers, with the smell of sweat, urine, and oil hanging heavy in the air. Hygiene was a constant battle, and for the poor, it was a losing one. the struggle for food and shelter. For the poor in ancient Rome, food was never guaranteed. While the rich feasted on exotic foods like roasted peacock, dormice, and honey cakes, the poor ate whatever they could get their hands on, usually stale bread, beans, or porridge. The Roman government did provide a grain dole to citizens, a sort of welfare system that allowed the poor to get a subsidized supply of grain. But the amount and quality of grain were often inconsistent, and there was always a risk that the supply would run out. During times of economic hardship or political instability, the grain supply could dwindle, leaving the poor without food. The cost of grain fluctuated constantly, and when prices went up, many poor Romans went hungry. But even when food was available, it was often of poor quality. The rich could afford to eat lavish meals, but the poor had to make do with whatever scraps they could find. Shelter was another constant concern. Most poor Romans lived in the insulae, but even that wasn't a guarantee of safety. The buildings were poorly constructed, and many were on the verge of collapse. Even if you managed to scrape together enough money for rent, you still had to worry about fires, disease, and the risk of being evicted at any time. The noise and chaos of Roman streets. Life in ancient Rome wasn't just physically dangerous, it was also mentally exhausting. The streets of Rome were a constant source of noise and chaos. Chariots, carts, and animals filled the streets, creating a cacophony of sound that was impossible to escape. There were no modern conveniences like soundproofing or insulation, so if you lived in an insula, you had no choice but to deal with the constant racket. Julius Caesar, aware of the noise in the streets, passed a law that prohibited wheeled traffic from entering the city center during the day. But this law did little to reduce the constant noise. In fact, it only made it worse at night, as people took to the streets for business or pleasure, filling the air with shouting, laughter, and the clatter of wheels on cobblestones. Imagine trying to sleep at night, knowing that the streets outside were alive with activity 24/7. The noise never stopped, and neither did the struggle. For the poor, the streets of ancient Rome were a constant reminder that life was always just one step away from chaos. A day in the life of the poor. For the poor in ancient Rome, every day was a relentless struggle for survival. There was no guarantee of a better tomorrow, no security in a world that seemed to value wealth and power above all else. The working poor had to rely on their own wits and strength to get by, often enduring grueling conditions that would break the spirits of those who weren't accustomed to such hardship. Many poor Romans worked as laborers, street vendors, or craftsmen, trying to scrape together enough money to feed themselves and their families. They woke up before dawn and worked long hours under the hot Roman sun, their backs bent and hands calloused from hard work. Street vendors hawked their wares, whether it be food, handmade goods, or simple trinkets, moving from corner to corner, shouting at passers-by to get their attention. But these jobs were physically demanding, often taking a toll on their health, and most provided little in return. If you were lucky enough to get a customer, you made a few coins, but more often than not, the streets were empty, and your sales were non-existent. Some poor Romans found work in the markets, selling produce, fish, or small goods. These markets were teeming with people, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread, raw meat, and fish. But for those trying to make a living, the competition was fierce. The wealthy could buy in bulk, paying for the best products and leaving little for those on the bottom rungs. Even if a vendor sold all their goods, the profits barely covered the cost of living. Life in the markets was a game of survival. One bad day of sales could send you right back to square one. Others had no choice but to beg. Begging wasn't just a fallback option. It was often the only choice for the very poorest. Those who found themselves in this unfortunate position would line the busy streets of Rome, hoping for the occasional charity from passers-by. They would call out to the wealthier citizens, hoping for a small coin or scrap of food, but begging wasn't a guaranteed way to survive. The rich may have given alms, but most Romans were too focused on their own struggles to worry about the beggar on the corner. It wasn't just the wealthy who were indifferent. Many of the middle-class citizens turned their faces away, afraid that a visible display of charity would be seen as weakness. Survival was never certain for the poor. There was no safety net, no health care, no social services, and no protection from the whims of the wealthy. If someone became ill or injured, there was no universal health care system to turn to. You either suffered in silence or hoped for some charity from a wealthier Roman. If a family member fell ill, the entire household would suffer, with no way to afford the necessary treatments or doctors. The rich could afford to hire physicians, but the poor could only hope to find an herbal remedy or some other makeshift treatment that might ease their pain, but more often than not, these treatments did little to alleviate the suffering. The poor had to rely on their own resourcefulness, finding ways to stretch the little they had, whether it was food, clothing, or shelter. They learned to barter, trading goods and services with others just to make ends meet. But sometimes, even that wasn't enough. The uncertainty of daily life in Rome's lower class was overwhelming. One bad day could mean going without food. A fire in the insulae could leave you homeless. If your employer decided to cut your hours or lay you off, there was little recourse. In the Roman Empire, being poor meant living in constant fear, not of immediate death, but of the slow erosion of life itself. Every day was a battle against hunger, disease, and the crushing weight of inequality. The poor were invisible to the powerful, and their struggles were never a priority in the minds of the wealthy. The Roman Empire, for all its magnificence and grandeur, was a place where the rich flourished, and the poor simply tried to survive. Women and children, the forgotten victims. Life for women and children in ancient Rome was even more difficult. Women, especially those from poor families, had few rights and little access to education. Their lives were dictated by the roles society expected them to fulfill: marry, bear children, and serve their husbands. Wealthy women had more freedom, but poorer women spent their days working in the home or performing laborious tasks in the marketplace. Women in the lower classes often had little choice in their lives. They were expected to contribute to the family's survival, but beyond that, their options were limited. Many poor women worked as wet nurses, midwives, or in the marketplace selling whatever goods they could. Some turned to prostitution to survive, as it offered a way to make money, but at the cost of their dignity and safety. Children from poor families were also deprived of a proper education. While wealthy Roman boys learned to read and write and studied philosophy, the children of the poor were often forced to work from a young age. Girls were taught domestic tasks, while boys were trained for manual labor, or, in some cases, sent to work in the family business. Education was a luxury that most poor families simply couldn't afford. So, what was life really like for the poor in the Roman Empire? For the majority of the population, it was a daily struggle for survival. Overcrowded, noisy, and dangerous, the streets of ancient Rome were a far cry from the luxurious world enjoyed by the elite. But here's a question to leave you thinking. How much has really changed? Are we still a society where the gap between the rich and poor defines the course of our lives? The poor in ancient Rome didn't just face physical hardships. They also dealt with a world that seemed indifferent to their suffering. And as we reflect on their struggles, perhaps we should ask ourselves, what lessons can we learn from history to address poverty in our own world today? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to join us next time for another deep dive into history's untold stories.